Alright, so I'm working on my new E46 M3 that I bought just a few days ago, and I knew I had a few issues with the subframe, even though this was supposedly reinforced by one of the previous owners. But I knew that there was a little bit of issue with the trunk floor. It looked like some of the spot welds had popped through, and also when they did some reinforcements, they cut some holes in the trunk floor, and they didn't patch them back up. Also, when I was crawling under it before I bought it, I noticed a little bit of rust, and it was a northern car. I bought it in Louisville, Kentucky, and the guy I bought it from bought it in Indianapolis, so I think it spent most of its life up there in the Indiana area, which means it's probably seen a little bit of salt. So I started taking the car apart, kind of taking inventory of what we got and seeing what all we have to do. I don't want to drive it too much if I know that there's some structural issues, and that's an issue with these cars. A lot of times you will have a cracked, they call it subframe, really it's like the trunk floor and where the subframe bolts to. So the M3s and all E46s, you need to check out your subframe if you haven't already, because it could look like mine, which is pretty bad. So here's what my trunk floor looks like. You can see this looks like cracks. This seam sealer is cracking because the spot welds that's holding this subframe to the trunk floor, all those are popping. We do have a good bit of separation and cracking through here too, and these are just where spot welds fell through here and this panel dropped down. You probably can't tell, but in here there's a hole where the wheel well is. So a couple of the spot welds broke there, and that's buckling, so may even have to do a little patch panel there, I'm not sure. Same thing's happening over here. You might can see that a little better. That little bit of light there, that's coming from underneath the car. And two, this is probably the worst as far as cracking. Where they cut it here, there's some cracks running there and cracks running around this panel here. These are two panels that were spot welded together and they're separating. So, and that, I'm not sure if there's any cracked metal underneath. I think there is. Moving around into the rear floor pans, there's our rust, and that's pretty good bit of rust. It's a little more than what I thought I would find, but you know, it's not that big of a deal. Since we work on old cars mostly, I'm used to seeing rust, so I'm not too worried about it. I know I can make panels and fix it. Passenger side's not quite as bad, but there is a little bit of rust going on. We'll fix that rust and then fix that crack, and you might can tell a little more from this side kind of what's going on. And like this panel here is actually separating all the way to here. You can see where that seam sealer is cracked. That's just because all the spot welds through there are popping and all the panels are kind of separating from each other. So like I mentioned earlier, this is kind of a common issue. I know it seems kind of extreme if you're not familiar with these cars. I knew that there were some subframe cracking issues. I didn't think that the panels would be separating from each other, but the more research I did, the more I realized that it's sort of a common thing. In fact, I bet there's a good bit of E46s, M3s, and non-M cars that are running around with at least this much amount of damage. And if I were to take this to a shop and not be doing the work myself, they would probably advise me to replace the floor panels, but I'm just going to put Humpty Dumpty back together and weld up all the cracks and seam weld or stitch weld where the little spot welds are coming loose. I think it'll be plenty strong, and then I'm also going to be adding some reinforcement. Alright, so I've been doing a lot of cleaning up and stripping down of the M3, and you can see I've gotten rid of most of the seam sealer and sound deadening stuff, but you can see just how bad the cracks are. So pretty much every spot weld that was in here is starting to pop loose. And then also we have a little bit of cracking there, and this one was an old crack that someone attempted to repair, but the welds were just garbage, so it just cracked and fell out. This side is pretty much just as bad, and you can see this here, all these spot welds and everything are just popped out. And I've already got the exhaust and the fuel tank dropped out, so I think the next step up here is going to be to drop out the rear subframe, but I wanted to fix the rust before I do that. Also, I decided to remove the side skirts because I found a little bit of rust starting to form underneath, and I found a good little hole here in the rocker panel. The other side, it's not quite as bad, but sort of the same situation. So here it is. I haven't treated it yet, but you can see just a smaller hole, and this is where the factory joint is. You can see the weld. All this had seam sealer all on it, and they just didn't prime it before they seam sealed it, so moisture got in it and started forming rust. Alright, so it's time to start making panels to patch the rust. And I made a Sharpie outline of everything that needs to be replaced, and then I used tape to transfer that outline onto the cardboard template. I used the cardboard template to make a metal template, and I've already got both of these made, and this will be the metal that patches the panel. I just have to shape it to this now. It's a little big, so as I'm shaping it, I can trim away some of the rust and then trim away some extra material, just so that I will have it fitting nice and tight. Alright, so I got the patch panels pretty much ready to start zapping in, but I wanted to show you what I did to stop the corrosion before I started welding. So I got the dash covered so I don't get anything on it because I'm MIG welding, and that is just cold galvanizing compound, and I sprayed it on the back side of this also. You cannot weld directly to it, so before I do any tacks or anything, I'm going to clean off where I'm welding, and then I will do my weld. Where the metal is going to be lapped together, it's going to give it some extra corrosion resistance. Where it heats up, it might burn off a little bit, but it's not going to burn off completely like paint would, so you're going to have a little bit of corrosion resistance between the two layers of the metal. Alright, so there we are, both panels welded in. Alright, so I got all the welds cleaned up and then primed it, seam sealed it, and then painted it just for the heck of it. And now I'm putting down some more sound deadening to replace the stuff that I scraped up off the floor. To do this, I went to a local hardware store and just got this stuff, which is really made for waterproof repair for like flashing roofs, you know, home improvement type stuff, but it's very similar to the sound deadening stuff that you can order online or get out of catalogs. It's probably not as good as the name brand stuff, but it's very similar to the sort of generic stuff that you can get. You get it in rolls that's like a little more than, I think it's like 12.5 square feet, and it's less than $20 for a roll, so that's like $1.50 a square foot. The generic stuff is like $3.50 a square foot, and the name brand stuff is like $5.50 a square foot. Now, the way I installed this is, you can just use like a roller, but what I do is I just apply some heat with a heat gun, warm it up. You'll see the aluminum backing start kind of wrinkling up, and then I just take a rag and just rub it in, and it does really well. It gets down into all the crevices and cracks, and it sticks to it really good. Alright, so I finished patching up the rust last night. I welded in some patch panels on the rockers. Here's the driver's side rocker. You can tell, you might can see there's a patch panel in there. I didn't try to get it super pretty like if it was a actual body panel. I just welded it in quick and easy, no Bondo, no filler or anything. I ran out of seam sealer, so I just used undercoat in this area, and I undercoated all under here too, where the rust repair was. So that's all the rust repair we're going to be doing on this car, so now I need to move into the rear subframe. Alright, so last night I got the subframe out so that I could sort of take an assessment of how bad the damage is to the chassis where the subframe bolts. And I knew it was bad, but I didn't quite think it was as bad as it is. So hopefully you can tell what we're dealing with here. So this is where the front of the subframe mounts, and this location, then there's another brace that mounts here. There have been plates welded in to reinforce this area. So some of these welds look okay, like this is where they repaired a crack. That's alright. But like this, I don't know if you can tell, but that's just horrible welds. Like you can see here, this plate wasn't even welded in this area, and another crack started forming coming up this way. But the back side is where all the damage is. This is where the rear subframe, or the rear of the subframe mounts. This is bad. I'm pushing up on this and the whole like trunk floor is moving. Over here, just as bad. That's a giant crack right there in this panel. That light is the trunk. You can see all the way through there. All this should be welded to this. This is where the spring sits, and this panel is just ripped away from, you know, at least a third of the spring perch here. This is probably the worst part here. There's actually a piece missing. This piece is not connected to anything. I think that's basically just seam sealer holding that on at this point. And someone repaired a crack here, or repaired. You can see these welds are not the best in the world. Doesn't look like they cleaned the area very well. So at this point, I'm still deciding exactly what to do. So a replacement panel costs like $1,300, and I don't want to spend that type of money on this, especially when I've spent most of my car buying budget and car fixing budget on this thing back here. So I already have an unfinished project. I didn't really want to start another full-on project. And I thought this was going to be a quick little, you know, maybe 2 weeks of working on this in my spare time. But at this point, I just got 2 very involved projects. I got to figure out what to do on this subframe. I think I'm just going to start cleaning it up, getting all seam sealer and stuff off of places that I know I'm going to have to be welding, and just try to take a better assessment once I've got it all cleaned up. Alright, so I started cleaning up under the car and trying to look at all the damage and see what our point of attack is going to be to try to fix all of this damage, and things escalated kind of quickly. So as you can see, there's a giant hole in the car now where this section of the chassis was that the subframe connected to. It's out of the car, the rear half anyway, so I can address all the damage to it without having to buy a new panel. And there's still some damage on the front half, but I can attack it from the bottom of the car. But since the majority of the damage was on this panel, I can get it fixed outside the car and then put it back in the car and weld it all up. For now, it's getting late. I'm going to go to bed. Alright, so I spent some time stripping down all the metal here that we have to repair, and I wanted to get all the seam sealer, undercoat, primer, paint, everything off of this so that I can really inspect it and see if there's any hairline cracks anywhere that I don't want to miss. Things like that one, which was completely covered up. I would have missed it if I hadn't have stripped it all down. There's a few little cracks here and there that I just needed to find, or else they would have spread after I got this back in the car. Next step will be to get rid of a lot of these nasty, ugly welds that someone put on here and start fixing all of the damage. Alright, so I've got the panel pretty well straightened out, and I ground down all the welds so that I could tell what was going on underneath them. Found a few more cracks underneath and found some trash that had gotten in it when it was welded. Another thing I did, I found pretty much every crack, and I'm still finding a few more cracks as I go, and I drilled a little hole at the end of each crack that will terminate the crack, give it a nice place to have it fully welded up, and that will stop the crack from spreading even after it's been welded. So yeah, it's making pretty good progress. Flip it over so you can see these pieces here, I cut them where they were welded. Actually, that one wasn't welded. I just fit it up nice. So I ground all their mess down, made it fit where it should, and tacked it again. So everything's pretty much tacked up. Once I get it welded up, then I can start fitting it back into the car. Alright, so I got most of the cracks welded up on this, and I was TIG welding the cracks, but whenever I got to these pieces that are where the metal is overlapping itself, I don't know if it's like a weld-through primer or something, and it just wasn't working with a TIG welder. As soon as you would make a puddle, it would just blow the puddle out and get all over your tungsten and your nozzle and everything. So if you're planning to be welding on a BMW of this vintage around these seams, you just want to switch to a MIG welder because it was just making a big mess with the TIG, and the MIG just blows right through it. So I'm going to finish up that, put this piece back on, and then I'll start fitting it back into the car. Alright, so I'm prepping the car to get ready to put this panel back in, and so that means I cleaned up every area that I'm going to be working on, and I also started drilling the holes in each of the cracks, and I wanted to show you a good example of why I drilled the holes. So see, this weld is one that was done when the reinforcement plates were welded in, and I'm assuming they didn't drill holes at the end of the cracks, and the crack just kept spreading from underneath the weld. Same thing happened right here, and so I drilled a hole in there to terminate it. If you have like a sharp point of stress at the end of that crack, and drilling the hole just kind of alleviates that stress, and then once you weld it up, it gives it a nice strong end to that crack. Alright, so I got the panel mocked into place, and it's almost time to start tacking it in where it is. I've just got couple jacks under it right now. Since this thing's had a lot of welding going on, and it had so much damage to begin with, and everything was flopping around and all, you know, it may take a little bit of persuasion to make things happen and get it put in the place that it needs to be. So I've started tacking the panel in place, and there was one place that was perfect, and I went ahead and threw a tack on it. When I started attacking on this side, it was like a little less than 1/8 of an inch gap, and it needed to come forward a bit, so I rigged up a ratchet strap, and what I did, I found a large bolt that went through this hole, a couple large washers too, just so it doesn't deform the metal. I put one on the underside too to keep it from deforming the metal even more, and you know, I can get a little more torque out of it. And I also put a smaller one here to get it to move forward a bit, but the result is on the other side here it's lined up perfect. But I can go ahead and start laying down some tacks here, and from there I know that my panel is lined up, you know, pretty good, both left and right and front and back. Alright, so I got the front half of that panel tacked in place, and before I do anything else, I wanted to rig up something that I can bolt in place of the actual subframe. That way everything stays square and it stays all the dimensions it needs to be. So I just whipped up this made out of scraps. I had to put some like platforms here to get it up because the subframe mounts are uneven. I drilled the holes. I tried to be very accurate. I got proper diagonal measurements, and everything is square and ready to be welded up. Alright, so I got the bracing installed in the car, keeping it all square and in the proper locations, and I started tacking that panel in a little more here. I had a small gap that I needed to close up, and so I had to use the weight of the car on the jack up against the panel to close up the gap, and that wasn't enough. So I added a couple 100 pounds of salt, which I would have preferred to use sand, but I'm out of sand, so salt's what I had to use. I just had to be careful to not get it on the metal or else it will corrode. So after I stacked all the salts in this corner, it closed up the gap and fell right into place. So you can see there's no gap right here anymore. You know, all the welding and stuff I did, not to mention all the flopping this thing did when it was just barely hanging in there, that just distorted the metal. So it takes a good bit of persuasion to get it exactly where I want it. But since I have the bracing underneath, and I'm taking my time to make sure everything falls where it needs to be, I shouldn't have any issues. Plus, there's a ton of adjustment in the subframe, so, but the little extra effort in making this all work will make it easier to align in the long run. Alright, so after a lot of welding and adjusting and getting everything where it needs to be, I got the panel in and totally welded in. So you can see I added a lot of seam welds where there used to be just spot welds. So the back side got seam welded to the trunk floor. Also along the front there, that's all seam welded. Around there where the spring perch is, all that got welded completely. So that should add a lot of strength and a lot of stiffness to the back side of this car. You can tell I did the same thing underneath for the front side of the panel. That's the part I didn't remove, but there was still a lot of spot welds and stuff breaking, so I seam welded all the way around and redid the spot welds too. And I also came down a little bit, about halfway, and seam welded all that too. And here's another place where seam welded all that in. I got the spring perches in, welded them all the way around instead of doing just the spot welds. So all of this is welded up. There might be a couple places, a couple cracks I missed just because this was in the way, so once I take it out I will hit them, and then all that will be good to go. So with all the work done, even though I didn't replace the full panel, it's still much stiffer and stronger than it was from the factory. And now I'm going to make it even better by adding some reinforcements. So that's it for all the rust and subframe repair on the M3. In the next video, I'm going to show you how I built all this reinforcement. Go check that out. It should be out soon if it's not out already. In the meantime, you can check us out on social media. We're at Racing Rejects on Facebook and Instagram. And if you want to follow me on Instagram, I'm at NickFerris53. Thanks for watching.